So, welcome back to the Moving On with Pain podcast. I am Morten, and I will be your host tonight when we are talking with Professor Mick Thacker about theories. Are they necessary or driving progress? What I want to be talking about today is theories and how they help us understand the world around us, but also how it makes sense of what the patient tells us and what the science shows. But my real question, which I'm going to discuss with Professor Mick Thacker in a minute, is do theories work? And if they do, how do they work and how do we utilize them in clinical practice? But before we start, I want to introduce Professor Mick Thacker. He's a professor at London South Bank University Institute of Health and Social Care. He's also got a range of titles such as PhD, MSc, CRAT-DIP-FIS, CRAT-DIP-MAN, NMSD, FCSP, and there's a lot of other abbreviations that I don't even know what's about. But Mick is first and foremost a physiotherapist. His ultimate motivation is to better understand the symptoms of the patients and to help clinicians work with them. And I think to sort of boil it all down and put my perspective on it, I would say I am here and we have invited Mick first and foremost because he's a mature and wise person who can give us directions that is probably a bit more comprehensive than you would get if you read a book or if you talk to 1,000 people for once. With that introduction, it is my big pleasure to introduce you here to our podcast. Welcome, Mick.
Thanks, Morten. Lovely to join you and with Nicholas, who is not on screen now, but is the technical man, but also a brilliant thinker in his own right. So real pleasure to be with you.
I was hoping that to sort of get in with the techniques and the theories that we're going to talk about, that we could probably take it in sort of a chronological order and start with, I was hoping that perhaps we could do like 10 minutes. And I know that you have a history behind each of these, your own history, you know a lot about the background, you're one of the most well-read polymathic people I've ever met. So I encourage you to sort of give us your depth and ideas and suggestions, but maybe also not to keep back on the stories. When the first sort of thing we could talk about would be the line labeling and pattern theories and the gate control theory. And then we move on to the neuromatrix and the default mode network theory. From there, we can go on to the more psychological or cognitively based theories and the biological theories, and then end up with more mathematical and philosophical theories. Having said that, let's start out with the first box of theories, the line labeling pattern theories and the gate control theory. If that was all I said, how would you spend 10 minutes to talk about it?
Yeah, thanks, Morten. And in one sense, this is the box which I don't have any necessary direct contact with, apart from, obviously my connection with Pat Wall and the people at King's College with the pain gate. I'm glad to say, even looking like I do with grey beard and grey hair, I'm not that old, So the gate theory was actually the year I was born, so published in the year I was born. So those are sort of historic theories, still hugely influential in many people's thinking and reasoning. I might start controversially, right from the outset, saying they shouldn't still be influential theories, but they are. So let's start with line labeling. Really owes its origin back to Descartes, 16th century. Descartes, as we know, incredible Renaissance man, incredible thinker, both a mathematician and a scientist, someone who constantly had to try and keep himself away from the wrath of the Catholic Church. But he had this very simplistic idea of the body as a machine and the mind as something sort of ethereal, God-given, and somehow had to sort of, or made a good attempt to try and marry these two things up in his sort of very well-established idea of Cartesian dualism. But the line labeling component of that really is based on the classic diagram, or best represented by the classic diagram of the little boy sat next to a fire, where he was suggesting that you basically, when there's something that was potentially damaging or was damaging, somehow the fire would break off, join at the end of a pneumatic tube. The pneumatic tube that ran all the way from the limb all the way up to the brain was full of fluids, animal fluids, as he described it. and you would have sort of, if you like, a pneumatic cycle that drove the noxious stimuli, not a term he used, but the noxious stimuli from the periphery and deliver it up to the brain, where it would reach the pineal gland and would ring a bell, and your unfiltered experience would be that of being in pain.
So is it fair to sum up the line labeling theory as if when something happens, it is transferred into the conscious mind or the soul of the person through these direct lines? And
Yeah,
is it the same stimulus that you experience, or are you experiencing the pain stimulus, so to speak?
Yeah, so to break it down, I mean, you're absolutely bringing me to task already. And we've had a bit of a giggle before we started about the way that you're actually very good doing that. And we've shared a few years in each other's company where you've constantly done it. So it's a real pleasure again for you to do it today. But yeah, so we're really talking about the fact that really you are putting pain into the system, and in that theory, and it's pain what you get out. And that's why I purposely used the term unfiltered, that actually you're passing a piece of information from the periphery up to the brain. And obviously that's a big challenge in the modern constructs, which you say, well, it never really could work, could it? You know, people couldn't have believed that, because, you know, a bit of fire isn't pain. But actually, how many times do you hear people say, you know, a painful stimulus? What do you mean by that? Because what we now would talk about, and correctly, is a high threshold thermal, chemical, or mechanical stimulus. It's not pain. Pain is something that is a construction of high centers. And I know there are people who are massive fans of Descartes who would actually use that as a defense of him, say, well, I don't think Descartes ever really did say it was pain that went in. You know, and again, that maybe is true. We're paraphrasing, but the principle he was giving has led to that. You know, it's only later that those modern defenders of dualism have tried to nuance Descartes' argument to perhaps fit better with what we now sort of think. And yeah, but I understand why they do that and how they can do that.
And I think when you have one model, it at some point it might be the model, but then we have these paradigm shifts and people start to question the models or the theories. And what would be sort of the first scientific discoveries that really challenged this idea of a pain receptor, for instance, in your mind?
Yeah, so oddly enough, I mean, you have to go to somebody who probably was a line labelist, Charles Sherrington. You know, Sherrington's work really looking at receptors and giving us terms like introception, proprioception, nociception. Maybe actually he didn't even coin the term introception. I'd have to check my history books on that. You pick me up as a polymath, and there I am getting things wrong straight away. But yeah, you know, certainly Sherrington starting to try and make sense in a scientific way of our sensory experiences, but still very attached to that form of dualism. And many people who came after, you know, people like Eccles would be someone who also sort of favoured that line labelism throughout his sort of neuroscientific sort of development, and probably was a dualist till his death. Actually, Popper was a dualist from a philosophical point of view. And more latterly, you know, some people whose names you would be very surprised with dualism, people like Dave Chalmers, who's, you know, tried to explain consciousness in his own particular way. He's a dualist in effect. So it still pervades much thinking. But yeah, I think Sherrington's the guy who tried to advance it as a science. And then from there, we sort of started to look at particular types of neurons associated with particular sensations. And we've got lots of famous neuroscientists, and the people in the neuroscience community will say, but you've missed out Golgi, you've missed out Muller, you've missed out all these people. But I've done that intentionally because I think Sherrington gets us sort of closer to the construct of nociception. Yeah.
Yeah. And if we were then to say, there's probably not that many people today who would be familiar, especially not clinicians, who would be familiar with line labeling theory. But could you think of any way that line labeling would still be a either valid or at least used theory or approach in clinical practice? So could there be any therapies that you think of where line labeling would be the underlying sort of bearing on underlining theory?
No. and I say that intentionally because I don't want to be someone who again, I'm really grateful to you, Morten, because if you challenge me to try and put my mind to thinking about other people think and explain things and come up with something that might sound credible, I'd like to think that that's one of my talents, but it's not my role or my desire to defend someone else's perspective that I don't agree with, if that makes sense. And so if I'm allowed to not go down that pathway, I don't want to, because one of the other things we know is not yourself and Nicholas sort of chunking this up, but someone could just chunk that up, take that up and say, well, Mick Thacker says, I see that all the time on YouTube and Twitter and stuff. They quote you. Some of them are beautiful. I can't believe I ever uttered such beauty. But lots of times I think, well, what about the words either side of that? What about what else I said? What about the context of what I said? So here if I may, I'm taking the fifth on that. I'm not going to defend that, because I don't think that's the way that we should defend any current practice. But are you saying, do I accept that there are tracks where there's a preference for a particular transmission of a particular type of information in the nervous system? Absolutely, I do. And one of the things that we've talked previously about, and I hope comes through here, is we're not trying to get people with any of these modern theories, which we'll come on to change really well-established knowledge where that knowledge is accurate and has construct validity. Definitely not trying to do that, but we're trying to increase that construct validity. Yeah, challenge a few ideas, but yeah, I mean, it is the predominant tract for nociception, the anterolateral spinothalamic tract, yes, but non-classical nociceptive tracts such as the dorsal columns and dorsolateral funiculus, we know from classical studies of sectioning the spinal cord where people thought, oh yeah, well, we'll go and we'll just section the spinothalamic tract and then all pain will go away. I won't name the centres that particularly pioneered it, but one of which was definitely in the UK. We know it didn't work. It appeared to work for a brief period of time, but sectioning the spinal cord to effectively get rid of any ascending nociceptive information is not a successful strategy to manage pain.
So we are taking some of this out of context. So I'll just try and briefly summarize what I have understood so far, is that we have this line labeling theory that predicts that something comes in and it goes unfiltered to the perception of the person. And if you look at it from a more neuroscientific perspective, you could say that the pathway it takes, the trajectory it goes by, these signals would be the spinothalamic tract. So there was suggestions to say, what if we cut the spinothalamic tract? Wouldn't that hinder the pain message, so to speak, as it was, to reach the perception area of the brain? And now the person shouldn't be in pain. And that has been tried and it wasn't successful, or was it successful in the beginning and then something happened? Or
yeah, I mean, in most of those cases, it did have some small amount of impact, which is always a dangerous thing, particularly in the hands of surgeons, because it sort of legitimizes them to take a short outcome measure, short temporal outcome measure, and then to say, well, it worked. When post-operatively they were okay, something must have happened 5-6 weeks down the line, which it did. I mean, and probably now we might think of neuropathic constructs, because if you ablate or damage the nervous system, you're giving all of the potential mechanisms of neuropathic pain chance to arise. So yeah, so again, your summary of that is absolutely accurate. So again, back to Descartes' boy diagram, because most people probably have that in their head, is the spinothalamic tract, according to Descartes, would be those sort of narrow sort of channels in which the animal fluids sort of flowed through the body. And he was particularly keen that the pineal gland was this sort of place where the physical world met this sort of mental world, because it was one of the few central structures he could find in the brain, and one of the singular structures. So there's only one pineal gland. Now, obviously, if you look for certain structures in the brain, they're bilaterally represented. So he was keen to find something that was midline central. But yeah, we now, obviously, modern imaging would say, oh, just so wrong. But the principles that underlie that have been really very powerful. We've renamed the not renamed the pineal gland, but we've renamed other structures in the brain as the pain centers. If you like, the pineal gland would have been Descartes' pain center, but we now know that that's not accurate. But it has been replaced by numerous incredibly clever people with different structures.
Yeah, we're going to talk much more about that. So I'll just hold you there to make sure that we take that in a separate. But I have this thought that the sort of 5 sections that we're going to go through is interesting in the sense that you started out talking about Descartes, who was a well-known mathematician and philosopher. And by the end of this talk, we will end talking about mathematics and philosophy. So there's a little one for you to contemplate about. But in the same sort of box, we're still talking about the first early theories of pain and pain theory, so to speak. We have this thing called the pattern theory, and then as a sort of add-on to that, the gate control theory. Would you first introduce us to the idea of the pattern theory as opposed to the line labeling theory?
Yeah, so the pattern theory posited really that it wasn't about, I'm going to use that term, unfiltered information. The pattern theory really said, oh, yeah, there is some filtering, and maybe it's a poor term in this context, but in other words, it's not just the passage of information in this unaltered way that is potentially responsible for the experience of pain, but rather it's the pattern of that information. So people got particularly interested in, the early work started recording neurons and saw that actually there was a lot of really spontaneous activity in neurons. That might have been an artifact of actually the technique, but they thought that was a real feature. But when they gave a stimulus, and not just stimulus, and again I'm using perhaps a modern term that they weren't using in the original research, but they found that actually that there was an alteration in that pattern of firing of the neuron. The action potentials potentially got quicker, in terms of sort of latency. The behavior of action potentials in terms of all its characteristics sort of changed, and they tried to establish that actually the same neuron could have several different functions which were totally dependent on the type of neural action potential firing, or spiking as we'd now call it. So yeah, it was really about a train of information in the pattern of action potentials that really determined the neuron's function. So rather than neurons having a specific function, they had multiple functions which actually were governed by the stimulus, type of stimulus, the intensity of stimulus, and the exposure to that stimulus. And that was reflected in this pattern of activity within the afferent neuron.
And would it then be fair to sort of, if we were to compare it, you could say the line labeling is like a single line for, like a train line that goes from one place to another, whereas the pattern theory suggests it's more like the tube map of London. So you have all of these stations with a lot of interacting stations or crossroads between the different pathways. Would that be fair to use that as a metaphorical understanding? Or are you suggesting that?
No, I think you're bringing us into sort of number 2 or number 3 of your sort of 5 questions you intend to ask. I think I think the thing was that the pattern theory could be, one could suggest critically it was just a supercharged line label theory, because the anatomy sort of remains the same. It's sort of the physiology interpretation on top of that anatomy that is the dominant feature there. It's actually, you've still got neurons, you've still got primary afferent going from the periphery into the spinal cord, you've still got a second order neuron, an ascending neuron from the spinal cord either to higher in the nervous system or to the sort of higher centers, and then you've got a third order neuron in that pathway classically described. So all he was talking about is, if you like, the type of activity within still that train line. So what I would say is, instead of pushing, I live near a train line, you're probably going to hear it soon. Instead of having a busy commuter train with 20 carriages on that line, you have off-peak 4 carriages. And so the number of information, the amount of information you can carry is different, but it's going down the same line. And in fact, actually, you didn't need to really, in the early pattern theory, really have to change the anatomy that much from the original line labeled theory. It sort of was added to it. And there, I think that's a nice thing to already emerge from our discussion, is that one theory's led to another. And I think we, including myself, and I know yourself as well from having listened to your talks, we can sometimes be a bit unkind to older theories. We can be a bit dismissive of them. I already have been, but the thing is, they were needed. Descartes was a man of his time, probably one of the cleverest people and bravest people who's ever lived. But he was a man of his time, and it took development of technique, development of ideas, speculation, huge amounts of speculation to move away from that. And I've used the speculation word intentionally, because that would take us from the pattern theory and the work done on a pattern theory to the pain gate. So maybe I've done your job for you to take us to the pain gate, unless you've got more to ask me about the pattern theory.
No, I just sort of want to reflect on a thing, which is that you sort of stated it earlier, and I think that might be a good thing for people to realize at this point, and you actually said it again right now, is that theories evolve alongside discoveries. So at this point, the only way you could study pain, as it was, would be through electrophysiology. So in order to understand the theory, you had that science of watching or measuring action potentials. So anything that wasn't measured by an action potential couldn't be in a theory. And then as you evolve and start to look at brains and start to look at other things, these things sort of evolve as well. And I think that's probably interesting for the listener, if you're not aware of that already. That's sort of the whole construct of a theory, is that you understand the world as it was. Would you agree?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. I mean, we have a whole battery of fantastic methods now at our disposal, and if I'm allowed to sort of blow up my own whatever for a second, there's very few people in the pain world who've tried to use as many of those techniques in their world as hopefully I've tried to do, and gone through, molecular neuro immunology and immunohistochemistry and electrophysiology, and then into brain imaging, etc., which we'll get on to. But yeah, we've got a battery of techniques, but then we forget back in the sort of 50s and pre-50s and then into the 60s with the gate, totally limited by very few techniques. That perhaps the most advanced, as you say, was ePhys, electrophysiology. We having played around with it, we would both call it ePhys, and it gives you membership of the club to be able to call it ePhys. But I think electrophysiology was dominant, and I think it's important to say that the dominant players in that world at that time were all electrophysiologists, almost with the exclusion of anyone else. Yeah, apart from probably a couple of clinicians who were incredibly influential. They picked up on the importance of the pattern theory. People like Lewis, famous book just called Pain. I have a copy of it on my bookshelf behind me, so I'm always tempted to turn around and look at it, which actually I bought secondhand, and it used to be owned by a guy called Barry White that to some of your listeners may also, not Barry White, not that I love machine, but Barry White, who was a very famous.
Lovely.
Yeah, funnily enough, he didn't talk like that, Barry White, but but Barry White was a very famous neurophysiologist who studied articular joint afferents. So I'm very proud to own that copy of that book. One, because it's a fantastic book written by a clinician based on his observations of patients, but also heavily influenced by the pattern theory. And obviously to own a copy that was previously owned by someone who was very influential in my thinking while I was a budding manual therapist, and seeing manual therapy through the lens of neurophysiology was quite dear to me. There's one for you.
And I think maybe this is where we should move on, and I think it's always a bit, I know it's very close to you, the gate control theory, because you have a special relationship with Pat Wall and also Steve McMahon, who's actually an electrophysiologist, as I remember it, and not a medical doctor or anything in that sense. So medical doctor of science, but not. So do you want to maybe move on to the gate control theory and give it a bit of context as well, because I think this is where I should probably say that I really met you when I was studying at King's. You had the MSc of Pain there, the MSc of Pain Science and Society, which was for me a enlightening 2 years I spent under your guidance, and I remember coming back, or you coming back, to explaining it to us and talking about the weight of history, or you always said you're standing on the shoulders of giants. So everything we're doing, we are standing on the shoulder of giants, and one of these giants for you, but I think for everyone here, would be Pat Wall and also of course Ron Melzack. Because if it turns out that they were wrong, there's so many things we need to reconsider.
So where to begin with that, and not to go off into some deep adulation, love for someone, human being. People say never meet your heroes, and then you do, and normally they disappoint you, but in this case not at all. Incredible human being, and incredible human beings. Through Pat, I got to meet and chat with Ron Melzack on a few occasions, and that was perhaps some of the highlights of my own personal career. I think Pat and I got on well as anyone could with him, because at times he's quite a sort of a closed character. Probably with the exception of Mac, who you mentioned, Steve McMahon, who I think if he was the closest that you could have to a son for Pat, he had a very different relationship again than I did with Pat. But I think we shared some politics, Pat, and some interest in physical therapy. He had a huge interest in physical therapy, a huge interest, and he was a fellow at the Chartered Society of Physiotherapy. As you pointed out at the beginning, the FCSP at the end of my name is the same honorary qualification. So Pat and Ron Melzack were at MIT. Pat being a medic by training, then a neurophysiologist by training. Won't go into masses of detail, but pretty much had rubbed up the British Society, the higher echelons of neuroscience in the UK, and felt that perhaps he was better leaving the country and going to America. And he went through a series of posts at some of the most august universities in the world, Chicago, Yale, and joined Warren McCulloch's group. And that's going to be an interesting thing, because Warren McCulloch, Walter Pitts, Jerome Levin, all of those guys were fundamental. Marvin Minsky was around there at MIT at the time, and they were in the sort of Department of Electronics, so they weren't in a pain lab, or they were using advanced e-phys as part of a battery of science that was going on in one very famous building. And there's a couple of books written on it, which I would urge people to read if they're interested. But a group of incredibly charismatic, funny, but superbly intelligent people and also surrounded by a bunch of incredibly good technical people who had learned lots of unusual techniques, particularly in the electrical physiology arena due to the war. And that's quite interesting. In fact, much of the money that was there at MIT at the time was from a military sort of the Ministry of Defense in the States, whatever actually that is properly called, was being pumped in. I think actually the Air Force into that group. But they were playing around with a lot of constructs, the early sort of, if you like, artificial intelligence, using this knowledge of electrophysiology to build models, and the earliest sort of algorithms, if you like. But also, they were really tying in physiology, known physiology facts, trying to push the boundaries of physiology at the time, and developing a lot of other electrophysiology techniques. And Melzack, though, was a neuropsychologist, so he's interested in psychology, but from a neurological point of view, not what was at the time pretty much dominated by psychoanalysis and the more sort of talky therapy type sort of and psychoanalytical methodologies. And the stories have been told how they got together and how they met, and the sort of test for Melzack was to go drinking with Pat, and if he could turn up the next day, then he could have a bit of lab space, and he managed to do that just about, and pitch up the next day. And from there began this incredible mixture of minds, and they started to develop the ideas as a very theoretical construct. So that's the first thing to say about the pain gate. They used some existing electrophysiology, and particularly Pat's work on things like primary afferent depolarization, to try and work out how the activity within the spinal cord varied depending on what stimulus had occurred in what sequence. So I probably haven't explained that very well, but they started to look at what happens if a large myelinated fiber fires first in terms of the behavior on small non-myelinated fibers and vice versa, and then different populations of the same thing. And again, not just them, but many other people have been sort of interested in that area, and they found some very interesting patterns of behavior or electrophysiology when I talk about behavior patterns of activity arise. So again, it was very heavily dependent on the pattern theory. The work that drove it was all pattern theory based, and they started to notice brilliantly some inconsistencies with what the pattern theory would have postulated, and that led them to sort of knock their heads together and start working on a theory. And they started working on it, put it down, and Melzack went away from MIT, and so they just corresponded. And that must have been something in the day, because no Wi-Fi, no telephones weren't great. They did it largely by letter and travel, meeting up with each other and meeting at meetings where they both were, and sort of thrashing these ideas together. And they came out with this idea, which I think is the most widely mistaught thing I've ever come across in my life, and that's selection bias, of course, because when I'm talking about that, I'm probably not that clever outside of pain. So that I'm sure there are other things that are taught equally as badly. But if you go anywhere in the world and people say the pain gate theory, it's because the large fibers travel quickly into the spinal cord and block off the slow passage of information from the slow fibers, and it's got absolutely nothing at all do with speed of transmission, but rather the pattern of behavior or the relationship of behaviors in terms of which fibers firing and what effect that has in actually depolarizing itself or another fiber, and therefore making it impossible to fire. And obviously then we know from subsequent work we have to overlay on top of that, in a more modern construct, the action of different neurotransmitters, both excitatory and inhibitory neurotransmitters. But it sort of took us brilliantly from the pattern theory, brilliantly into sort of the modern arena of neurotransmitters, as well as electrophysiology. And so it was a marrying and particularly the genesis of a modern way of thinking and a modern research agenda. And the thing to say about that is, it predated by 10, 15 years the discovery of the opioid receptor and opioids. So, and they were laid on top of that theory, of course, and could fit. So, yeah.
And again, that's a completely different way of doing science to do immunohistochemistry or any other of the sort of more chemical-based approaches. But so, if I get it right, you're saying that Patrick Wall and Ron Melzack and the whole, they were not alone. They're probably doing this with a lot of people, but they sort of, they were collecting the ideas and they were testing things that would be compliant with the pattern theory. But when they did that, they found out that something else was going on. And out of this came this idea that what if the neurons are interacting and maybe they are sort of, this is a bit dumbing down perhaps too much, but they're competing to be the ones who have the most influence on the ascending signal from the dorsal horn and up.
Yeah, no, that's a lovely way. And in fact, actually, thank you for maybe making my life easier later on, because this sort of idea of competition and something wins out over the other is there. But you also know me well enough to know that I don't like too much metaphor and I don't like too much dumbing down, because I would prefer people to challenge themselves intellectually, not from a snobbery point of view, but just so that we don't dumb down, so that we don't get back to that point where, oh yeah, it's just to do with, if I rub myself, they're quick and they block the gate off because the slower ones are going in. And it's always made me sort of want to draw spikes on a board and say, what happens if you got the spike from the small one just at a perfect place between those two fast ones? Surely then it would have an effect, because it can't work. And as soon as you show that to people, they go, oh yeah, it can't work like that. So how does it work? And then we get onto a more complex view. And that's again a nice thing to emerge, because Pat, my favorite quote, which I know he's on record as saying it's almost impossible to replace a simple schema with something that's more complex. People don't like that.
That's a beautiful quote.
And it's very anti people like Richard Feynman as well, who would say, if you can't make something simple, you don't understand it. But sometimes, just, something I'm really keen on saying, sometimes you can't make things simple because they're not simple.
Yeah, and even if you make them simple, and so that people can understand what you're talking about, it doesn't mean that they're understanding what you know.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think that's the point in not dumbing things down unnecessarily.
Yeah.
So as I understand it, and you please correct me if I'm not wrong in your opinion, or if I am wrong in your opinion, the gate control theory was probably the first theory that was being tested, but also had clinical implications, so directly clinical implications. So for instance, Pat traveling up to Washington State in Seattle and trying to develop the TENS arboretors and spinal cord stimulation. So this idea that there was not only a theory, but the theory itself had clinical implications. I don't know if that was available before, but at least that's what I understand from the story, so to speak.
Yeah, I think you do have to be a bit careful, because I think, he was, I know from a personal conversation, he always said, get far too much credit for things when there were people like Lewis, who I already said, were trying to pay attention to some of the science that he also took part in. He wasn't just a clinician. He was, in London, in and around some brilliant scientists in their own right. But he was trying to marry those things up from maybe a different perspective, the science and clinical practice. But yeah, you're absolutely right. The TENS and many other theories, maybe, I'm not saying manual therapy came from that, because it far predates that, but it seemed to revolutionize things like manual therapy. It probably made people sit up, and I'm not sure that acupuncture fits very well on any level with the gate theory, but it certainly people shoehorned it into that, and even the early days of cognitive behavioral therapy. And I mean, let's not downplay the gate theory, because I suggested earlier people might not want to sort of still base themselves in that. But it revolutionized the study and management of pain. It created a real focus and something that was, on one hand, simple enough for people to sort of really understand. So it replaced a simplistic framework like line labeling, and that was a real purposeful intention on the part of Melzack and Pat, you know, with something that was still reasonably easy to understand, hence the misquoting of what it really contains. But yeah, it really revolutionized everything. But I think it's really important to say, sort of almost the day after they came up with the theory, both of them were probably engaged in work and encouraging critics such as Peter Nathan. You know, it's a very famous paper by Peter Nathan slating the gate theory. And Peter Nathan was one of Pat Wall's best friends, you know, and this was encouraged by Pat. And a lot of people became very defensive around, you know, Wall and Melzack and Wall. Yet they were encouraging these people who, in many cases, knew them well, friends with them, to really go to town on it. They themselves were really trying to test out its construct validity. You know, they were very keen that it was a theory that needed challenging and building upon.
Yeah. Okay, so I already, you know, missed my timeline with, I don't know, half an hour or so. So I'm going to try and sum up the first box, which was basically that we thought to begin with that there was something traveling, and once it hit you, it would go straight up. And only if you were damaged or if the lines were cut, that wouldn't happen. And then through the pattern theory, it sort of evolved this idea that you could actually modulate, it's a word we'll probably use today, the signal. So even if something came in, that'd be nociception, as we would probably call it, it can be modulated at a spinal level. And that was where the sort of story ends at the first point. Would you agree, or is there anything before we go on that?
I would totally agree, but I think the most important thing, and I think you're giving me a chance to say that, it was the first time the brain was brought into play. You know, and again, that's back to Melzack being a if you like, a brain scientist, a neuropsychologist. He was keen to say, you know, in this framework, look, you know, it's likely that something from the brain is able to act at that level to modulate, you know, ongoing behavior, and in fact could, again, sort of really a description of neurotransmitters, but, you know, in their classic diagrams, plus and minus signs, you know, it's likely that there's both a plus and a minus from the brain. In other words, the brain could enhance function at the level of the dorsal horn, but could modulate or inhibit it. And I think it's a nice way of saying, if we use the term modulate, too often in particularly the pain world, it's used to indicate inhibition. But modulation is a bi-directional process, both facilitation and inhibition. And exactly. they put that in their classic diagram, and I perhaps overlooked that. So thank you for giving me opportunity to put that in.
Well, that gives me the opportunity to say, well, then there was a development, and we ended the first story with the gate control theory, Melzack and Wall Melzack, however you put it. And then Melzack developed first it was the matrix of self, the neuromatrix of self, and then it sort of transitioned into the pain neuromatrix. Would you perhaps illustrate or discuss the theory and explain to us how you understand the theory first, and then we can try and see what we know about it today afterwards?
Yeah. So Melzack, you know, went away and probably sort of, no, not in a friendship or personal way, they diverged, Pat and Melzack, but thinking wise they did. And there's lots of people who probably would say, you know, Melzack sort of went on a journey that sort of brought us more up to date quicker than the journey Pat was in, because he was doing hardcore electrophysiology in the time I spent with him and knew him, together with a guy who never gets any credit, so I'm going to do it here, Malcolm Lydia. You know, they were doing some fantastic phys experiments within the nociceptive system and other systems, you know, during the time when Melzack was still, you know, proposing the matrix. So Melzack got particularly interested in, you know, if you like, some of those great test cases for our understanding of pain models, and one of those being the phantom limb pain. So he started to really sort of begin to look at that, heavily influenced by his working with people like Joel Katz, etc. And they started to really come up with this idea of how you might better explain phantom limb pain. You know, the gate theory was challenged directly by constructs of phantom limb. You could sort of make it fit, but you would have to go through a lot of conflation and convolution to get there. You know, it became a little bit too tenuous a sort of a link to keep there. So he got very interested in trying to build a new construct to, in the first place, to explain phantom limb pain. And the idea there is, he was saying, you know, effectively still based on inputs, sensory inputs to the system, but also thoughts, feelings, that actually you're probably inputting into a brain, and it was very brain bound, very brain centric, that you're inputting all these different inputs to the brain that acts on some neural substrate that he called the matrix, the body self matrix, was the term he used originally, to produce an intermediate output, and that's the right term for it, which he called the neural signature, and that would then drive a set of responses which were normally movement related or motor in a wide sense of the use of the term outputs, which could be also some other biological systems being activated, but it was quite movement focused even from the beginning. But if you look at the whole thing, it's a very behavioralist model. It's got inputs, something goes on in the black box, the brain, and then you have an output. And as we go through this,
if I can, if we could just stop there, because at least to me that was a, you know, interesting to see how you started out with a model that basically gives you a model to understand how you behave and why things happen in the person. And then one of the things that it was trying to explain was phantom limb pain, but there was a range of other things as well it was trying to explain.
Yeah.
And then
it was a pain model, and so just to put pain onto that, which is important, and I don't know whether that's your intention to get me to do that or not, but you have done, which is one of your huge talents, is all of those different factors, be they physical stimuli or thoughts or feelings, would act on this sort of central hub, neural hub as he called it, to produce a neural signature. And the neural signature is actually what pain was. Now that's a really important point to make at this juncture, because we're going to go on to other theories that people say, oh, it's just the matrix just revisited. No, not at all, because the idea there was that you had input produced, if it was the right types of inputs, produce this thing called pain, and then you would make a response to being in pain. And that could be an action, or it could be back to modulation. It could be you make a modulatory action to get rid of the pain. So there you would posit that pain comes, if you like, after the sensation. It's the result of the sensation. There's a causative connection between the inputs or the beliefs or the actual conglomeration of all those things, the joining of those things. So we shouldn't separate them out. But then you get pain, and then you do something about the pain, either move to try and get rid of it, or you take action neurophysiologically to try and get rid of the pain. And that's going to, I hope we show that that's at odds with some of the theories that I particularly favour?
And I just to try and toss a bit of confusion in here, I've read a few times that Pat Wall was believing that pain should be viewed through sort of philosophical ideas of monism. So there's one pain in one person, so to speak. And then we have Descartes, who is, you know, suggesting the dualism. There was a body and a mind. Would it be fair to say that you have these emotional, motivational, and sensory inputs? So it's a triism that produces the pain.
So what again, you're doing a beautiful job at making me say the right thing, so thank you. So that neural hub, that sentient hub that Melzack called, so all these words are, you know, I'm intentionally using them because if you read in different accounts, you'll read those terms: sentient hub, neural signature. But one of the things that underpinned that neural hub, or that sentient hub, was these 3 dimensions of pain. Sensory discriminative, cognitive evaluative, and affective motivational. You know, so if you like, those, you know, constructs, those dimensions of pain are there, and that was obviously revolutionary, because again, that nicely leads to where we're going to go next. But it was then saying, there's not one brain center, there's not an isolated center, there's components that look after one dimension, there's components that look after another dimension, and again, there's components that look after a third dimension. The sensory discriminative probably could still lend itself back to the line labeling and pattern theories. I don't think that dimension of pain necessarily moved that far away from those things. But then why should it? We're talking again this evolution of idea building on the previous ideas, you know?
Yeah, exactly. And maybe the only thing was, of course, you describe it in different ways, but the underlying sort of underbuilding perspective was new advances in technology, and that you could now
technology and the influence within psychology of behavioralism and all of that stuff. I mean, now you could say by the 90s, the late 80s, 90s, that was actually beginning to die out in its original guise, you know, the Skinner and all of those sort of guys' ideas. But there was no doubt that that's the model, and you know, and not to jump too far ahead, but that's still very much, you know, the matrix became, you know, Lorimer Moseley's reconceptualizing pain model, Louis' mature organism model, Louis Gifford's mature organism model. So it sounds like I'm just name checking and dropping in the fact that these are my mates, and they are my mates, but I should give them their full names, you know?
Yeah.
But
yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, you're supposed to.
Yeah, the thing that I'm sort of trying to get to here, because I think this is probably why I got into the game. I started to have an interest in it, and we're now in sort of the early 2000s, approaching 2010, when I started to do my MSc in London. And at this point, there was knowledge about that, the idea that there was this triism of the brain that was giving it had some validity, but it was really difficult because there were studies trying to look at the brain, but the data didn't really fit the model. And then at this point, this new sort of perspective and a Carrier and Baliki type model with the default mode network theory was sort of coming into the picture. So I think maybe you could explain to us, what's the default mode network and how did that come about?
Can I go one place back,
of course you can,
which I actually thought you were going to take me to next, was how the body self matrix theory, psychology, philosophy led into the construct of a neuroanatomical pain matrix. And I don't necessarily think that chronologically you've gone the wrong way. I think all of this is sort of happening, and again, you know, beautiful thing that a theory that may or may not be right sort of generates an whole load of work, some of it going in perhaps the wrong direction. But there's this idea then, particularly with people like Bud Craig sort of throwing in introception, throwing in a challenge as a line labelist, an anatomical construct of line labelism, you know, and then started to sort of throw in, this fiber goes to this part of the brain. Is it part of this? How does that fit in with this three-dimensional aspects of pain? And so a load of people then got the fancy toy, that Baliki and Apkarian have as well, called the functional MRI scanner. And, you know, so not just doing structural, not just taking black and white photos of the brain, but making pretty pictures of the brain. And we don't have enough time to tell people how that works, but, you know, it's an indirect measure of what's going on in neurons based on blood flow and the use of oxygen in the brain. And there's plenty of very wise people who could tell you absolutely how it works, and that's a very crude explanation, and please forgive me, all those people I've done neuroimaging work with in the past. But people started to say, okay, look, can we build a pattern of what happens when you put people in these scanners and you give them a noxious stimuli? And of course, the greatest percentage of that work, and certainly all the early work, was done on so-called healthy volunteers using very controlled experimental noxious stimuli. And here, it might be useful for us to say here, we could say pain stimuli, because being in the scanner and talking to the people, they were confirmed as producing a pain experience. But that is quite interesting, because once you've got confirmation that a stimulus has produced a painful experience, you know, it's sometimes used by people I much respect as saying it's a painful stimulus, but they would defend themselves by saying, once we've got confirmation from the person that when I do this to them, it was painful, I can call it a painful stimulus. I don't like to do that myself, hence I call them noxious stimuli, but people do. And I think that that might be advantageous to somebody, yeah, out there. Maybe not, maybe confusing, I don't know. But we do these controlled stimuli, noxious stimuli, particularly heat and chemicals, because it was easier to do those things with MRI compatible equipment, because obviously you've got this big magnet that can suck anything sort of into the middle of it, and if your nose is the thing central within that very narrow tube and you suck something metal into there, you can have a very bloody nose. And the stories are horrific. People have done that. So people started to give very controlled stimuli and look for groups of responses, and from that they indeed did establish certain nuclei within the brain, certain centers within the brain, whatever term you want to use for it. Some, you know, a lot of neuroscientists in neuroimaging call blobs in the brain, you know, and in one way that's quite nice because they sort of just covers a big area of color. Started to say, oh yeah, no, there's very definite structures when we give these very controlled stimuli in healthy volunteers, so-called normals, but we might touch on that with the people like Tim Salamon's work to show that these people actually aren't particularly normal at all. They score very high on the Machismo sort of scales. But you know, essentially there was this sort of, if you like, neuroanatomical construct that arose, that certain centers seem to always light up and be seen when we give a controlled stimulus in a controlled environment when we study MRI scans.
And can I take a time out there, because that sort of combines perhaps what I was asking at and then where you came from. So you have these images with, which are, you know, there are images, but basically they're a ton of data that you're looking at, so zeros and ones. And you're doing something which we could consider to be normal. You're doing nothing. You're not giving them a noxious stimulus, and then you're giving them noxious stimulus, and very crudely you're subtracting the normal from the noxious.
Yeah.
And then you end up with this, with this bit that you put onto the picture. So the blips and the blobs. And now you see the blips and the blobs, and they would be the things that you would suppose is going on, or the areas of the brain where you suppose something is going on. And now you start to add the theory. So let's say you have this picture of a brain with blips and blobs, And you could go one way now, which would be the neuromatrix model, and say these beeps and blobs are showing you the pain matrix of this person, or you can go the default mode network. And how would you interpret the same thing with the default mode network?
Yeah, so the default mode network was when they put all these normals in, they sort of observed this fact that when you were not attending to anything, now this is quite a difficult construct if you've ever been inside an MRI scanner, because it's bloody noisy, it's claustrophobic, it's hot, it smells a bit depending on how clean the scanner is. I'm playing there.
And yourself.
And yourself, and whether you you know, and I have to reference this, what you feel about the experimenter who's doing the experiment. There's some fantastic stories for another day. All of those things considered, they sort of felt that when the sort of, if you like, mind sort of wanders to sort of this nothingness, you know, quite a mindful idea that you're sort of thinking about nothing in particular, you're not trying to think about what you're going to do when you get out the scanner. Really difficult to get your head around that. But anyway, let's just say that you're not focusing on anything intentionally, if that's possible. Then you have this activity in 2 or 3 areas of the brain. And one of the reasons why I'm not just rattling off these names is because both within the matrix and the default mode network, if you read 10 papers, there's probably 2 nuclei, 2 brain centers that everyone agree on. And then there's probably, you know, across the other sort of 3 papers, complete disparity between what they include. So, you know, is the hippocampus part of the pain matrix? Is it part of the default mode network? You know, indeed, how can it be both? You know, and in fact, it can be both, because obviously different areas of your brain can have more than one function, and they can be active when you're focusing on something, but they can be equally as active when you're not focusing on something as well. So this is what's quite difficult about a true deep understanding. You know, you have to get big numbers, you have to replicate it, you have to make sure your experimental paradigms are really tight. And I have huge respect for neural imaging and neural imagers, because when they do the work properly, it's really a massive team, both technically and scientifically, but it's also incredibly difficult to get really good, well-controlled paradigms. And the fact that some people manage that, and you've mentioned some, Baliki, Nat Carrion, you know, the team I've done lots of work with, Matt Howard, Steve Williams's group, people like Karen Davis's group, who hugely admire Tim Salomons, who I mentioned, who was part of that group and then had his own group, and now has his own group. You know, Irene Tracy,
Dave Saminovich. Yeah, there's tons of them.
I'm going to just upset someone, Katy, who works with Irene. You know, all these people who I actually know as well, who are going to just shoot me. So apologies, all you brilliant people out there who have a fancy scanner. Brilliant. But, and I don't mean that in any sarcastic way, you know, brilliant. But there's bots. So the default mode network is this sort of area that's sort of supposed to be active. But then if you read some of the modern papers about the default mode network, it's sort of linked to certain types of salient experience as well. So it's not just there when people are not attending to anything. It can be there when they're attending to salient information about the future, about certain aspects of the external world. So these really simple models, simple constructs like the pain matrix and the default mode network, when you really begin to nuance them and really test them out and their validity, and you know, Karen Davis has got a beautiful paper showing, you know, interactions between attention and switching on and off of your default mode network, and then what the effects of nociception are, and maybe we can link a few papers as part of this. You know, that's really quite a complex sort of dynamic going on, and we're still in our infancy, and that's what we've got to say. But what I would like to draw attention to is then the work of people like Andre Moreau and Giando Ionetti, who sort of had that beautiful series of papers looking at, you know, is there really an anatomical construct of the matrix? and demonstrated using different really complex but brilliant sentiency paradigms, giving different sentient stimuli of oral, noxious, non-noxious mechanical stimuli together with visual stimuli in a very sort of complex temporospatial pattern, whether we could see any real differences. And the basic answer to that is no, between noxious, non-noxious, visual and auditory stimuli. I mean, there were differences, but in many cases, in many of the nuclei that were classically described as that's one of the centers of your pain neuromatrix, they were just as active, showing just as much activity to those other stimuli. And actually, the more forward-thinking, broad-minded neuroscientists had no problem with that, because they didn't believe in unimodal function of any particular area of the brain. So, you know, I love the work of Louis Pessoa, who sort of studied the amygdala, you know, in so-called fear center. But his work and his co-workers have really shown it's heavily involved in cognitive functioning, in really deep thinking paradigms, as well as this I'm frightened sort of paradigm which it's been classically described in. And I love that work because it overcomes this very simplistic notion that each function of the brain has one function. No, it probably contains neurons that might even have, if you like, totally the opposite, 180 degrees the other function, you know?
Yeah.
The
But
PAG
I think
would
that's
be a great example.
That may add, that may add to our sort of understanding of what our theory is and what do they do, because we're adding a new layer here, which is when we have all this information, whether that be in the clinic or, as you say, in the scanner in this case, you need to make sense of that. And theories are really the best we have to make sense of it, although they're not perfect. So there is a good argument that the pain neuromatrix is flawed as a theory because it cannot explain the things it postulates. But we know that because we have studies that have tested the theory, but they don't give us a better theory either. So we have to, you know, you used the term infancy. We have to realize that sometimes we get these new theories, and we're going to come back to some of them as well. And we need to be careful how to understand them, and specifically understand the limitations of a theory in general, but also how used has it been, to use an old Karl Popper term, how falsified is it? How many studies have actually given meaning to otherwise not meaningful data using a specific theory? And I think I would agree with you if that's what you mean with the infancy. I think that's what you mean, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. That, and you know, you brought us on nicely. I would urge everyone to read Russ Poldrack's work on sort of reverse inference from scanning studies. If you can't understand that principle of how you have a causative line, in which direction that causative line is, whether you wait to see something and then try to interpret it after you've seen it, rather than having a experimental paradigm that has an hypothesis that you're testing, that you're trying to keep in mind falsification for, and then interpret. Not let's do something, look, and then let's try to interpret it. And so much neuroimaging has been done on that. I would urge everyone to go to Russ Poldrack's work, and again, link in whatever links you have down there or up there or that way or this way. People do that on YouTube, don't they? We're not on YouTube, but down there.
But if you are listening to this, look down. It will be down there somewhere. I'll take the opportunity to. Oh, sorry. You can end off this box.
Yeah. Well, if you're listening, in theory, you can't. That's not the instruction to read. We're giving you an instruction to read, not to listen.
Okay, so
neuromatrix going.
You alluded to earlier when we talked about the early phase of the neuromatrix that all of a sudden this behavioral approach and this psychological research perspective, which was apart from the psychoanalytic approach, but using more the brain as a pathway to understand consciousness, was introduced into pain research. And at some point in around, actually maybe around the same time, as the neuromatrix was popularized, this idea of a fear avoidance model came out, and we can talk about the range of these, like the onion skin, and there's a range of these models which have that in common, that they're more narrative, they're more cognitive, they're more sort of metaphorical, but they have provided an understanding for clinicians. So would you care to talk about the fear avoidance model, and then we can see where we take it from there?
Yeah, and I'm by no means the expert on fear avoidance models. I have to say that with respect to obviously Valayan and you know, Lorimer's done a lot of work, and Paul Watson and Steve Linton and all this. I'm again forgetting people, and then you know, people who I've worked with and all the things. Chris Main, just these fantastic people who I have huge amounts of respect for, and I hope some of them have a bit of respect for me too. But yeah, this idea that this thing called pain, or the expectation of pain, or the anticipation of pain, will change behaviors, so that if we believe something's going to give us a pain experience, if something has given us a pain experience in the past, if we anticipate something as painful, this sort of makes common sense, because most people don't like being in pain, that they're going to avoid it. And obviously that, when it's, you know, using an evolutionary biology term, when that's adaptive, when it serves a purpose that's meaningful and has a valid outcome, then that makes perfect sense. The issue is, in clinical settings, people started to say, well, these things become a self-fulfilling sort of prophecy, self-fulfilling cycle, that, you know, you start to have such anticipation, expectation of a pain experience that may be confirmed by your own reality of having tested out that experience, tried to do it, and oh no, it hurts again. You suddenly stop doing things, and gradually over time you do less and less, and actually less and less you seek the need to confirm whether or not that anticipation or expectation is a correct one. So more and more you beginning to do less and less. And we know the end result of that from a physical functioning point of view is disuse atrophy, weakness, stiffness, all of these other things that are highly likely then, when you do some activity, to in themselves generate a noxious stimuli and a painful experience. Not that you necessarily need a noxious stimuli for a pain experience, but you know, you're actually doing something on, if you like, devitalize fit tissues. That's not obviously a word.
Deconditioning.
You know? Thank you. That's the word. So yeah, but in a sense, and this will tie in nicely when we talk about this construct of priors or expectation. You know,
which we'll come back to.
Yeah, which comes so to dominate your very experience, that, you know, you make behavioral changes to it, and those behavioral changes in themselves have an outcome. So there's a sort of a causative, you know, and causation is very difficult, but, you know, I've become very interested in causation because of people like Ronnie Anjum, Steve, my mind's going, Roger Kerry, Stephen Mumford, sorry.
Stephen Mumford,
and lots of other people.
But I'm gonna just
take you down that direction.
No, because I'm getting a thought now, for many reasons. I think because this is going to be tricky, because now we're going to talk these theories, the next theories, which is the fear avoidance or the cognitive models and the metaorganism model, and it easily fiddles into what we are also going to talk about in the end, the predictive processing and all of that. So maybe what we can do is briefly talk about the consequences of the fear avoidance model, and then go on to do the same with the metaorganism model. I'm gonna postulate that one of the reasons that the fear avoidance model has had such a huge impact in physical therapy or physiotherapy and in many other aspects of pain management is because it actually gives you clinical directions. So you have this idea of a vicious cycle and a positive cycle, and the thing that changes the vicious cycle into a positive cycle is exposure. and knowledge to sort of use, or education, if you were to use modern terms. That's my perspective. How would you think about the impact of fear avoidance model and similar models?
I would totally agree with you. I would reframe all those words and these days into something different, and I know we've got to wait for that to come. But absolutely, I think though that the academic physical therapist in me says, wait a minute though, are we not sure that we're not guilty of that reverse inference that we've pointed at the neuroimages when we look at the fear avoidance? What is it? Just because it gives us an opportunity to use our skill set?
Yeah. So we are looking for it in another sense, rather than it's actually there. It's a phantom.
I'm not saying it's not there, but I think its influence might have been dominated by constructs of reverse influence, like inference and influence, that you think, oh, I could do something about that. And actually, just because you call yourself something, can you do something about that? No, you've got to understand the very essence of the concept to know whether or not your particular skill base, whatever you call yourself, is going to be right. And that comes down to individualized care, realizing what are the factors, not looking on the model and ticking off, or anti-Popperian sort of constructs within clinical practice of confirmation bias, where you just want to see things, or the model, so you treat the model, not the person. And they're really important. They're really important things.
I've got to stop you there, because that is probably one of the most important things that I ever realized as a clinician with a growing academic background, is that we shouldn't treat the therapist, the theory. We should treat the patient always. So in this case, if we were to use a fear avoidance model, if you see someone being fearful and they also hurt, it's not necessarily true that their pain will go away if you treat the fear or the avoidance. And I know that sounds so simplistic, and I'm just putting it out there that I have been accused of doing that, and I have done it, and I admit it. And it was such a great experience to realize that I was doing something wrong, because it gave me the opportunity to actually change it. And
I think, again, wherever you're professionally bound to, and competencies, etc., all these incredibly important constructs and components fit into that. If you're a movement-based therapist, you try to somehow shoehorn movement into there, and we know that movement so often is incredibly powerful. But all of those people out there, particularly in social media, who are massive proponents of exercise, as am I. But remember that any effective therapy must always be able to be overdosed or underdosed, and therefore, if you've got an effective therapy, just to say movement or exercise will always help, well, you've got to be better than that. You've got to be able to dose titrate the movement or the construct of movement to the person. And we know that effectively you're saying, again, is there behavioralism? Is there behavioral change within the construct of fear avoidance? Of course there is. Of course it is. And if we went down a different discussion to the one we've had today, we could have gone back to 4 dice, and operant conditioning, and then down a different lineage, down a different pathway to get to that point as well. And we don't have time or the inclination.
I would say on that note, that actually gives me a good note to deflect a bit, but maybe also to round this up with a different model in the same box, as I would say it. The onion skin model that was proposed by John Loescher, and others have provided similar models. I had the immense joy of interviewing Loescher in September of 2019 in Seattle, and so he had the picture of it on his wall, and I said, so what do you think about the model? Is it still a theory that you would think applies, because it's so generic that you can add it to almost any patient? And I see it more like almost like an interview guide, that there are things you can talk to the patient about. And said, well, actually, now that we know all that we know, I think if we are anywhere from where we were, if we had moved anywhere from where we were, and then he gave this quote, I would say we need to find out, what does the pain prevent you from doing that you either need to or want to do? And I think that's really profound. So that's summing up this idea of what is pain to you.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, to not over technicalize that, he's talking about reverse inference there, because the people who misuse that model go, I've got to peel all these layers off, and those layers are always in that order. So I just sort of go down to the peeling of the layer and get down to the bit I need to do. But some of those layers aren't represented. How many times have you got an onion and you're trying to cook and you cut the thing in half and it's got another outer skin for sort of layers in?
Yeah.
That probably is more akin to pain. It's the weird onion, not the typical onion. Not that I'm trying to suggest that any people with a pain experience, if you're listening with a pain experience, you are someone who says, always identifies as being a pain patient. Horrible term. A person with a pain experience or is experiencing pain better. Then
let's wrap
you
up.
are not an onion.
let's wrap up the box of cognitive and psychological models and open up the next box, which is the biological models based on other theories. In this case, we're going to talk about the mature organism model and your friend Louis Gifford, and maybe you want to say why that has a biological approach to it, or how it is.
Well, I could start, and again with a gentle tease, and say I'm not so sure it takes us into the biology as a model in one sense, in that it's so much dependent and relied on the neural matrix model. So if we say the body neuromatrix model was a bio-behavioral, and I would add genetic model there, because actually there's a huge genetic component, and again later on we might push against that a little bit. So we shouldn't forget that. But yes, but again, from what I've just said, if it's got genetic basis and a behavioral basis, that is biology, and we shouldn't forget that behavior is biology too. Psychology is biology too, right? So
I feel like I need to paraphrase myself. I wanted to say that we have models, theories from the area of stress that has provided insight into also being maybe applicable to understanding pain. Without pain and stress being the same thing, they might have theoretically a construct that could be used.
Yeah, and I look to my left. That'll mean nothing to any of you, but famous Gatchel and Turk book, where Melzack has a chapter in there where he redefines the matrix in terms of stress and cytokines, very dear to my heart. Get an element of neuroimmunology. So I think we shouldn't necessarily. I'm a massive fan of obviously my good friend Louis Gifford's work, but we've got to say that it built on directly and in parallel with Melzack's own development of the idea. But the mature organism model stands out for me. And then to go back to Louis itself, it is a biological model. Louis was a biologist before he became a physiotherapist, a zoologist, and an evolutionary biologist. And those things were really key to him to incorporate. Not, as I said, Melzack was completely ignoring biology or genetics and evolution. But I think what Louis was trying to do was make this really, really, really clinically applicable. Like he wasn't really interested in the theoretical construct. It remains that, but he wasn't really interested in that or trying to develop a theory. What he was trying to do was to produce a model that would be as equally useful for clinicians and people treating pain and those people experiencing and managing their own pain and having their pain managed. And then how do we make sense of that common experience that we all have, and also the therapeutic experience of two people, charged with trying to achieve the same goal, one as a clinician, one as a patient. How do we make sense of that? And Louis' natural inclination to do that was to turn inwards to his great knowledge and his great experience of evolutionary biology and zoology. So again, it seems so it seems so at odds with all modern agendas in one way to say a mature organism, we've reduced the person down to an organism as if they're an amoeba or a rat or a mouse or a polecat or whatever is your favorite animal. But to an evolutionary biologist, that's what people are too. And it can seem really quite harsh and cruel, but anyone who knew Louis knew that he wasn't motivated by anything other than deep human kindness and love for human beings, so I don't think it applies to him, but it can sound like that. But the mature organism model, probably what it did is it rounded the neural matrix model. So in other words, what it really did is it brought the outputs back to some sort of direct influence on the input, so which I think is there in the neural matrix, but it's not as clearly stated as in Lewis' model. So when we change biology or we change function, we're trying to do that to impact on the initial cause of that experience. And that, I think, is one of the really powerful tools that have meant that I myself and other people have reformulated it into sort of quite a consistent model with some of these newer ideas that we're going to go on to discuss.
Would it be fair to say, as just like with the gate control theory, where we have this possibility at the synapse to learn things, that neuroplasticity that we're talking about, that is also a big part of the mature organism model, that the maturity of the organism is that it's a learning organism? Would you agree?
Yeah, so again, it's very hard, and I sound like I'm doing Louis down, and I'm absolutely not, to say, well, go back to Melzack. I mean, Melzack had all that pedigree in sort of, Hebbian learning, and then it goes back to Carl Lashley, and he's in that lineage, he's in a direct lineage of that, and we're sort of in a different lineage, and Louis was in his own lineage, but part of that, Pat Wall lineage too, in his own right. He had a good relationship with Pat. But yeah, I think this is a point at which, and maybe where I'm struggling, is there's a blurring going on here, in a good way. There's this sort of real challenging of ideas, thinking how to improve on a theory, giving real respect to that theory, really trying, if we can, to incorporate the bits that stand up, getting rid of the bits that don't, advancing on from it. I think the most important thing to give Louis back the real respect he deserves is there's a physical therapist, as he would say, a mere clinician. He did a master's degree, he did his manual therapy, but when he was really playing with those ideas, he'd come back to Cornwall and he was working in his private practice. He was a physical therapist, he was a physiotherapist, a jobbing clinician who wanted to think deeply about what he was doing and how to do it better. And there's a fantastic thing that for people from our professional background, but any professional background, you hear this, oh, I'm just a clinic. Don't ever apologize for being a clinic, and never, ever, ever insert that just word in. Never, ever insert that word. That's ludicrous. Bloody controlled environments and laboratories and scanners and all this stuff. It's easy. It's technically difficult, but it's easy. It's not complex. Forgive me, all those great scientists I know, but I think they would get what I'm saying. The clinical world is complex, but Louis was trying to make sense of that, and on top of, it's still got all those components of thoughts, feelings, belief, culture, expectation. Influencing the if you like, the sentient hub. He didn't really use that term, but it's there still. He's talking about sort of tissues, sort of processing, environment, culture, everything. So it starts to incorporate more sociology. Again, correctly, I should say, not that the matrix didn't have that there. But am I saying that it's just the bastardization of the matrix? No, I think it's a clinical utility model of the neural matrix, and much more informed by day-to-day practice than the matrix. And so, the natural tendency for Louis then was to sort of somehow build his patients onto that model and test his model against patients. And I think, again, what an incredible, insightful powerful thing to do is, you know, I've got a model, I'm pretty confident it's correct, but now I've got to see if it works and the features, if you like, fit, going back to his old lineage with Maitland. You know, does it all fit together?
Yeah,
How does it fit together? You
I
know,
was. That's interesting. I was having the same thought here. Maybe this is a good point to also suggest that we as physical therapists have been discussing theories to explain pain for many years as well. And my first thought when you said that was Mackenzie, that idea
yeah,
that he was doing stuff and he was he was reflecting on his clinical practice, building upon that to create a pattern of recognition
and
that could
self,
then lead to a
yeah.
specific therapy.
And unfortunately got it all wrong, and I'm going to get murdered for that, but you know, this idea of disc and what discs do under sort of pathological or normal conditions, we know that's come on a hell of a long way. But absolutely, we shouldn't forget that. We shouldn't forget that he also used those clinical experiences exactly like you say, and we shouldn't forget that really what he used those experiences to ultimately develop, which a few people have forgotten as well, is to get self-management as the primary component of the person's care, so self-care. And
Yeah,
that was profound, and that wasn't you know, that was before we had lots of knowledge of sort of bio-behavioral sort of medicine. It was probably ignorant of a lot of that. And again, I don't say that with any nastiness. Having said that, I do want to say, you know, he was perhaps one of the most financially wealthy physios who's ever lived. So there, you know, there is an agenda of keeping to old constructs to make sure you keep money coming in. Yeah. And
well,
I
we're
only put
gonna.
that in to warn people, you know, always think of motives,
Um,
and I'm not just saying it. We might edit that out. We might keep it in.
well, if the mature organism model is building on or is a more clinical application of the neuromatrix model, you don't have to comment on this, but I would suggest that the majority of the common physiotherapy models, Mackenzie, Mulligan, Maitland, and all of the things that we and I have been doing, they would be implications or clinical applications of the line labeling model, also known as the end organ model, where you treat an end organ as if that was causing the pain.
Yeah,
Would you
that's a
agree?
wonder. Yeah, no, absolutely agree. I'm not necessarily with all of them, because I think, you know, you could argue that actually they're a lot of them are based on this sort of normative function of a nervous system and the construct of normalizing back to a normal anatomy, if you ever know what that is, and a normal end organ function, as you rightly put. Maybe you could argue on defense of Mackenzie, he might have been the one who was a little bit against that, because he was sort of really primarily pathologically focused. But I still think you could draw that in, you know, a pathology, what you're trying to do with a pathology is normalize it. Yeah. But absolutely. And but also a lot of those constructs, particularly manual therapy, and I'm really grateful to you for giving me the chance to say this, are based on the nervous system, if you like, functioning in what Clifford Wolf called the control mode, where, you know, when you put a low threshold stimulus in, you get processing, again, quite line labeled, you get processing that equals no pain. When you put a high threshold stimulus in, you get a pain experience potentially. And the critical, not that Wolf said that, but yeah, that's the basic premise. And the idea that you do a test the structure and it gives you a pain has got to be based on that. So, you know, and a causative link that is there's something going on in the structure you're testing. Yeah. And obviously
Yeah.
that all those models have been challenged massively by really, we've missed someone out of the equation here, Dave Butler, right? And this is, you know, Dave and
Thank you
Louis
for
cannot
remembering to
be
bring that in.
separated from each other. As much as people want to, as much as that's happened, we've sort of been guilty of that, which is why I'm correcting it. Dave and Louis did their manual therapy together, were great mates, great thinkers together, and really, you know, many of us have a single book to owe for really this physiotherapy pain revolution, and that book is actually a BMJ or British Medical Bulletins, BMB book, published in the early 90s, red and white book. Again, got it on my shelf behind me, and the story goes, and it's a true story, that Dave and Louis on a plane together going to teach sort of a mobilization of the nervous system course, which was at those days quite biomedically focused on doing things to nerves. But that's unfair.
And I think they were actually flying to Denmark.
Yeah, well, you sometimes have to go to weird places to teach. Oh, forgive me, Denmark, I love you. And they. Yeah, they're reading that book, and that book contains some fantastic and seminal chapters. In fact, if you don't own a copy or have never seen it, it's one of those wonderful books that you could still go back to, and lots of it holds up. And there's a particularly powerful chapter by Pat Wall in it that they read, and Clifford Wolf, and they read that, and so on and so forth. And it really got these ideas of, maybe all these things we've been doing do depend on a particular function of the nervous system. And without picking myself up, that was actually a book that I bought the day it came out, and I read it, and without, at that time, well, that's not true, I knew both of them by that time, but without knowing they had read that book, I'd also read that book away from them. I wasn't on a plane to Denmark. And it's such an influential read for any of us who read it, and it really rocked to the very foundation of us who read it, sort of the things we've been taught as manual therapists, because I'd done my own manual therapy training in the UK with the MACP, and tried to become really good at it, and it really thought about my own practice and the fact that I was supposed to be reasonably good at doing that, and then looking at outcomes and realizing I really wasn't that good or that effective, which obviously large components down to myself. But you are seeking for answers, why not? And in that book, we found potential answers. Now, I'm not saying with the passage of time, I still think the same way, but again, in evolution, some ideas we might now think are outdated, constructs we think are outdated, but they were powerful enough to make a paradigm shift in certainly us three. And in that, whilst they were on the same plane, that happened to them separate, because they weren't sat with each other and discussing it. They were set separate, and that book became something they read separately. They didn't lie awake in bed like, won't mean anything to some of your viewers, like Morecambe and Wise in their pajamas and passing the book between them, or want a bedtime story between them. I don't think, anyway. But they read it, and the lights were going on, and all sorts of fantastic stuff. And that book, for many of us who became really good friends, became very close to each other, both in terms of thinking and writing, and spent really amazing amounts of time in each other's company. I'm reminiscing as I speak in phenomenal experiences. And Louis, myself, and Dave taught a course up in Newcastle. It was a 5-day course, and I can honestly say that I had never experienced as much pain through laughter in my life before or since. It was really one of those most fantastic sort of life experiences. And I think anyone who was on that course, and I know people like Ian Stevens, who's done a lot of writing and informed people in a really lovely way, and never given the credit he deserves. So Ian, if you're listening to this or ever get a chance to listen, good on you, mate. And we, as ever, like you mentioned earlier, Morten, you know what, I've never taught you anything. We never taught Ian anything. We've all learned together, and we continue to do that with everyone we have a learning experience with, whatever the perceived.
It's kind of you to say, but there is always inspiration to get out there.
Yeah, but it's not like you have to rub my sort of ego, backside or whatever, because we know how we feel about each other, and that feeling is mutual and one of respect, eh? But yeah,
exactly.
That was a fantastic period of time, but I've lost our way. So
And
bring me back
I
on
think
track.
maybe to get us back on track here, because we sort of came on to talk about the end organ model and how it fits with manual therapy to some extent, and one of the things that you said was, even if you're the best at manual therapy, it doesn't give you necessarily the best results. So there's so much more to it, and this is something that is, a completely different talk, of course. But I think maybe the take home in terms of where does theory fits into it is that even if you use the right theory, treatment doesn't have to be effective, and vice versa. Even if you're using the best treatment and getting good results, it doesn't mean that the theory is correct.
Yeah. And we're back to causation, and and I should have also mentioned Matt Lauser, because if I don't, he'd kill me. Who's obviously become particularly interested, who also has a background in manual therapy as well, as does Roger, and linking with those great philosophers they have. But I think we don't have direct causal sort of directions that are that easy to establish, or maybe they are.
But maybe before you go, because if we could say that we're closing down the mature organism model and the sort of related discussions, and now we're going to take out the last box that we're going to talk about here today, which is sort of the predictive processing, the philosophy, causality, all of this. I would say the newer aspects of
Again,
pain.
maybe I'm gonna take you back to a very important figure who was hugely influenced and still is by at least by both the people's work, but obviously we lost Louis to prostate cancer. And again, take this opportunity, if you've got spare pounds and you can spare them to anything, give consideration to prostate cancer. Also what Pat Wall died, and also my lovely brother-in-law. So I always try to get it in, because it's not just an old man's disease. But we're missing the person who was heavily influenced by those people, and probably together with them, and far more than myself, is the most single influential figure in physiotherapy, pain, neuroscience research, clinical practice, and that's Professor Morten Moseley, someone who is a good friend and colleague of both of us, who we've enjoyed the company of, and is quite frankly the most unique, not always in a good way, individual you're ever likely to meet. He's worryingly doesn't feel fear, and so many experiences in his company are unique. Let's leave it that way. And I owe Lorimer huge debt of gratitude for all the kind words he's ever said about me, and they're all reciprocated, and huge respect for him and his work. And he was, like a lot of physical therapists in his time, sort of lost his way a little bit because of the difference between, paralleling what you've just said, the difference between an expectation of outcome and an expectation of efficacy, an expectation of your own performance compared to the reality that is clinical practice, and really was probably ready to pack it all in. And then he went on a Dave and Louis course, and the rest is some history, of one of the greatest thinkers our profession's ever produced, learning from some of the greatest thinkers that our profession's ever produced, and going to places where not many people in our profession have ever gone or achieved the sort of success and impact that he has.
Yes. Standing on that story, there was an article by yourself and Lorimer in the Australian Medical Journal a few years back, talking about this idea of a person in pain rather than a brain in pain.
Yeah.
And,
so if we can we deal with Lossie's idea, because it was a natural evolution of the mature organism model that we should say, was heavily influenced by Dave Butler as well. We shouldn't forget his role in it. Definitely not. And so Lorimer sort of built a reconceptualizing of pain model in a very famous sort of paper back in sort of 2005, if my memory serves me correct. and a paper I still share to this day, and a paper we discussed at length while it was being put together, because we were playing around with ideas about CRPS together at that time, and what the mature organism model could do, couldn't do for that. And Lorimer developed this idea that has huge overlap with both the matrix and with the mature organism model. But I think he gave the world this construct of the brain, sort of asking how dangerous things are, where all this stuff is going on, and the context, culture, beliefs, whatever, sensory inputs, how dangerous is this really? And then effectively making an output that tries to reduce the threat level, danger level, how dangerous this is to the body. So, again, sort of ties in also the line we need to bring in is sort of the construct of people like Pat Wall's idea that pain is a need state. It drives something that you do to get rid of it. It develops a need that then develops strategies or should lead to strategies to try and relieve the person of it. And that's something that Lorimer really brought into his reconceptualizing pain. So he started to see these outputs that were part of Melzack's model, part of this circularity within the mature organism model. He started to really see this as an advanced biological model of how you might act on the world. And again, that's something we'll come on to again, and that was a real sort of development, a major development, and this idea then that whatever you do can be more latterly in their terms be seen in the work he did with Dave. So back to Dave Butler, in safety in me and danger in me, and things which I'm maybe not a big fan of in those terminologies, and again the metaphorical nature of that, but yeah, I can see easily how you get to that. I would describe those things maybe in a slightly different sort of construct, which we're going to come on to. But we shouldn't, I not just because he's one of my best friends in the world and someone I hugely respect, but that's the journey, that's the continuation. And then, of course, being a little bit, on the outside sometimes of that sort of axis, not in a bad way, but thinking differently and not trying to get too heavily bogged down in any one particular approach, and being hopefully skeptical about everything as a driving force that motivates me to find out more. I started to say, well, how can it be just an isolated brain? Surely there's an interaction with the world that actually your own model shows. Your own diagram there says it cannot be just about a brain. It's your brain's interaction with these other external factors and internal factors, which weren't probably represented enough in the matrix, therefore not in Lewis' model, and therefore not in Lozi's model. There's not a huge introspective perspective, and that brings us back to Bud Craig, who we mentioned, and his model being overlooked by many people. So
I think maybe, Mick, now is probably a good time to recap a bit, because all of this, of course, is simple to you, but you are talking about a lot of things at once. So I'll try and recap and see if I have got sort of the gist of it. So we have all these theories that Lorimer has. Maybe on a side note, I would say one of the interesting things, and one of the reasons that I didn't put it on the schedule for today, is that Lorimer and Dave, for that, say they never really gave a theory, but they gave directions for clinical practice. Now that's maybe a contemplation for another day, but I think that's really interesting. So they could have gone out and created a new whatever derangement for the back model, and with an application that fits it, and they didn't. I think there's a lot of
I suppose I would
genius.
Slightly disagree in the sense that I think the reconceptualizing pain diagram has, without necessarily an intention, become a model. It's become a brain model that many, I would go as far as to say, if you then take it to explain pain, it is the central model behind that, and what emerged out of that is the construct of a neurotag. That picture in their original Explain Pain book is the dominant model, which really, even if they didn't intend it, underpins their work. And I think it is in itself a model, but you could very harshly say, oh no, it's just the Melzack model, or it's just the mature organism model. It's no different to that. But I get where you're going from, so I shouldn't have stopped you, but at the same time I felt the need to stop you, so I did. So apologies.
Well, you're the guest in the show, so we are
It doesn't matter.
interested in your opinion.
No, we're interested in our
And
opinion.
it was a side note anyway. So what I'm going to do is try and recapitulate. And I think one of the things that came out of your talk just before was that we have this idea that you're building on a neuromatrix, building on a mature organism model, and then adding this, how dangerous is it really, and the dangers in me, and it's almost, it's so easy to think that there's a little person inside of your head saying, how dangerous is this really, which I'm confident was never the intention. But the more you sort of utilize it as a metaphor and talk about it, it's easy for people to understand it, and this construct of pain in the brain as opposed to pain in the tissues of the body, the other tissues of the body, you should say, emerged out of that. And then that is probably where your story starts, with this article that you co-edited with Lorimer.
And again, you know, thank you, Morten, because probably what I need is you with me all the time to make sense of anything, or people to make sense of me. So again, real thanks. And I do mean that in the sense that, that you've already highlighted there that actually, if you take, for example, this sort of homuncular representation, this person in the brain, you know, I've used the word representation. So then you go to a philosophy that's emerged from that, of representationalism. What does it mean? Does it mean this homunculus, or does it mean somehow some form of coding representation in the brain? What does that really mean? So you know, there were all these things filtering on the background. You know, mine and Lorimer's Sav conversations, he always calls it. Not that I think we ever drank any Cabernet Sauvignon. It's normally beer, you know, or something else together. But you know, those
he knows what a working lad wants.
Yeah, exactly. No poshness for me, but there was this real sort of like, let's have a look. Let's constantly batter our ideas. Let's constantly batter each other's ideas in this really respectful, productive way. You know, I think people think, you know, go around going, oh, I don't agree with this, don't agree with that. But, you know, it's always needs a reason. You need to give your reasoning, and you need to be able to defend that reasoning against. So, and when someone enters into that process with you, great things emerge from it. And we started saying, you know, like, I'm not comfortable with this isolated brain. You know, are you your brain? Is your brain you? You know, it became so fashionable. You know, at the same time, we both sort of, you know, supervising or beginning to supervise Abby Tabor, who was bringing a real sort of Bayesian perspective to things, and she needs and deserves huge credit for that, and shaping my own and Lorimer's thinking and challenging that. And so all this was going on, and Adelaide 2012 NOI conference was a month long of sharing ideas, having fun, really testing things out. And it was a real productive time, and that paper was sort of emerging in us and sort of saying, oh, you know, are you an isolated brain? No, you know, what philosophy's challenging that, and we've looked, and one thing that bound Lorimer, myself, Dave, Louis, Pat, Melzack, all these people I've mentioned, and thousands of others I haven't, and more latterly yourself and other people who've continued on that journey, is that, are we able to better, you know, what do we need to better able us to answer the difficult questions about pain and the experience of people with pain? And again, please note that probably all of this looks like it didn't include patients, and I hope we've highlighted enough, but probably not enough, how influential patients have been to all of us, not just Louis, but to Dave, to Lorimer, to Pat Wall. Pat Wall would never let you do any research that didn't have a clinical perspective in his lab or around his labs. Okay, so hugely influential. But yeah, we sort of said, look, me and Lorimer had sort of, we'd done different PhDs in more sort of physical therapy, motor with Paul Hodges, all that great work from that side of things. I'd done a molecular neuroimmunology PhD, and then we'd both sort of been around imagers, Lorimer at Oxford, me at the sort of IOP in London, and we'd sort of on a journey to try and discover more and more about pain, and then it just raised more and more questions. So then you start to look at different fields, and I'd always been naturally inclined to go into philosophy and to read philosophy. And then I sort of had a series of great conversations with people like David Papineau, with Tim Bain, with David Bain, Kevin O'Regan, and Andy Clark. And, and then you start to talk to sort of philosophers, and they start to sort of ask questions, cognitive penetrability, what about the explanatory gap? How do you get from, all this stuff going on in the meat, back to pattern theory, back to line labeling, back to all of these ideas that's sort of going on in meat. How does that become anything? How does it become this subjective, personalized experience of pain? Can that happen?
And you in a sense back to where Descartes let go, aren't you? So you're trying to discover the difference between the meat pack and the conscious mind, if you were.
Yeah, and you brought in the word consciousness earlier, and and that's a word that's often not even connected with traditional pain study, Yet we all accept it's a conscious experience. So we've started to sort of say, well, how does this meat give you that potentially? Now, we're nowhere near having an answer to that still. We're either on that journey or you're not, either directly or indirectly. But we were sort of really throwing a load of complex sort of ideas at the paper in that paper. I'm really proud of that paper. And it sort of introduced sort of, without us overstating an activism and embodiment and, in a 5E perspective. And, we really started to sort of develop some of those ideas. I'm not saying we were the first or the only people, but I think within a certain fraternity, that was a really useful paper to sort of challenge a few people and ideas, and challenge ourselves, and our similarities and our differences all emerged in that paper. And also the body of work, certainly I went on, has really been driven by that paper,
I at least when you are from the outside and have been looking at the way you've been working through things, you've really flirted with a lot of directions, if you were, within both mathematics and philosophy and all of that. And you mentioned Abby Tabor earlier, and with her also Bayes. And maybe this is a good time to explain what is Bayesian statistics, but also what is predictive processing sort of as constructs, and then we can maybe move from there on to how does it relate to pain, or could it relate to pain?
Yeah, so I think probably if I'm able to duck that one, I'm not really going to explain Bayesian statistics, because I think that's beyond me. But in terms of Bayes theory, what Bayes theory is saying is, that you effectively are constantly making predictions, or you have experience that form a prediction, form some knowledge of your world. You then gain current knowledge of the world, and you make a comparison between your current state against that predicted or previously experienced state, and then see whether those two things fit or not. If they fit, you do nothing. The outcome, if you like, of that is nothing. The model's good fit for what you've experienced. But if it's not, then you update the model in some way to bring it in line or closer to that experience. Now, it doesn't happen that the model necessarily is a perfect fit. It could be an adequate fit. It doesn't mean that process happens in one single step. It can be a series of those, testing of models and updating of those models till you gradually get to a better fit. But that's basically the principle of Bayes. And again, those people who are Bayesian will probably never forgive me again for putting it in that way. But I like to.
And I could do even worse. So I can try and paraphrase what you just said. So
yeah,
and give a model. So if we've all reached out and grabbed, you know, some whatever a carton of milk or something, and then you have this expectation that it will have a certain weight, which you're not even aware of because you just have it. It's in you. It's sort of learned in you somewhere, and then you grab it, and it's either lighter or heavier than you predicted, and now you sort of just pull it up if it's lighter, and then you need to readjust. Otherwise, that milk is going to be everywhere. So you quickly readjust, and for some reason, you know, you use that. Either it was a glitch, it's simply, you know, you mistook something, or probably you're going to use it to predict in the future. How would that be? Would that be sort of fair-ish?
Yeah, it's a lovely analogy, because you can go back to, you know, if you say the average carton of milk or bottle you buy has a certain characteristic weight. You know, in certain parlances that would be called an affordance. It's got a property that you can make a prediction about, and that your experience tells you something about, and then it gives you a chance to act upon it in a particular way, right? And I may be overcomplicated now, but you know what your full milk normally feels like. The last time when you went to your fridge, it was a full milk. What you haven't seen is someone pour half of it away. So your expectation is still based on your previous experience of that milk. No need to be surprised that the milk, as you've actioned, doesn't weigh that. And obviously you've got to do something, because then you could drop it or you could spill it or whatever. But the next time you go, somebody without your knowledge has poured the milk back in. They didn't fancy the glass of milk, so they poured it back in. So it may again surprise you because the milk is full again. So it's sort of using previous experience, previous knowledge, and that nicely ties in with a mature organism model. Mature, as you mature, you're building models of the world, you're building experiences. I like to think of it as references. You've got a set of references against which you can compare the current state based on experience, learning, etc.
And am I understanding it correctly that these are not necessarily conscious references? So
No.
you used the idea that you could be aware of how much milk there is, but actually in a carton you have no idea. I mean, if I had supper with my family, someone took milk and I'm not keeping account, so I have no idea. So there's got to be this under consciousness response mechanism, if you like. That could be a motor control, or it could be involving the whole of my brain. I don't know, but something is happening the minute I grab that milk that I'm using as a reference to how much power to put into it.
Absolutely. And the thing is that what happens in these constructs, and we're all guilty of, to try and to make it simple, we take a very unimodal approach, to use that term. We've gone, you know, oh, the milk, but you're getting extraception, you're getting interoception, you're getting proprioception, you're getting all sorts of things. You know, you may not be aware that you've seen one of your daughters pour that milk in her coffee and then her cereal. You weren't processing that consciously, but you were processed that information. You know, it can be called framing. You know, it's how people like Darren Brown does his work. You know, Darren Brown does his work. You know, it's a way that we can, you know, you're not always consciously aware, and that's an important caveat you've made there. Where it becomes like everything, Bayes suddenly, or Bayesian perspectives, or PP suddenly explains all this conscious world. Well, I'm not sure it does. It actually makes more sense of a subconscious world than it does a conscious world in many circumstances. So, yeah, and then back to pain. We learn.
Can I stop you just a second before we go into pain, because I can't believe that we've been talking for, I don't know, 2 hours and 30 minutes perhaps, and you haven't mentioned Carl Friston once, so I'm going to do it. So this idea of free energy, you might need to explain that to us, but this idea that you need to control free energy, that's a basic principle of, you know, at a molecular level. And one of the things that I know, I've challenged you with this before, and I keep struggling with PP as a theory and free energy as well as a theory, to understand it, how it would work for a whole organism such as a human being, the mature organism, if you like. Whereas I can see how it would work at a molecular level or even in a small organism, but a really complex organism like the human being. Is it like having two lives, actually, a conscious and a subconscious life? You probably know where I'm going, so I'm interested in what you think.
I suppose I'm going to do what I've done constantly through here, is we sort of got to make that jump. So how do you get from base to free energy? And the point is that the formulations share several factors which, you know, are so overlapping that you probably can't distinguish, but they do have unique components too. But and that might emerge from what we're saying. But the free energy principle really, again, is that you have to control your own as a living organism, or a component of a living organism, has to be separated from the outside world or from other components within that organism. Yeah, so effectively we have sort of, you know, semi-open systems from the sort of cell up to the entire organism. So we, you know, maybe the easiest place to go is to say, look, if we take the principle that everything needs to sort of separate itself from something else, you can say the simplest way to do that is to build four walls. Yeah, so think of a cell, big square cell, and it separates itself from every other cell by having a cell membrane. But that cell could only exist for a finite bit of time while anything inside the cell is giving it nutrition. So as soon as you use all those nutrients up, the cell will die, yeah, or start to break down. And that's basically the principle of entropy. If you don't control it, you get death, yeah. And so you can pass through various stages of dysfunction before death occurs. Or, you know, if you think of cells therefore need to have nutrients coming in and excretion of metabolites. So you have openings either side of the cell. Now, if we build that up to a person, food going in your bum, your food going in your mouth, and poo coming out
coming
your
in
bum.
from mum, going out your bum. Yeah, that's a nice one.
Something about me more than anything else. But bullshit normally comes out one's mouth before you say it. But yeah, I mean, at whatever scale, you know, giving simple examples. But then you've sort of got this. There's a simple system going in, going out. You know, can do all sorts of things to move along gradients, to find more food. So to do that, you need to build some form of ability to move within the cell. Simplest way, put actin and myosin contractile proteins in there. If we want to excrete things, we normally do that by excitosis. So you need to have organelles within the cell like Golgi apparatus, etc., which form vesicles which can dump things out. And then you start to build a complexity that starts to resemble a cell. And then you've got cell upon cell, which is, after all, our bodies, our animals are formed, our plants are formed, and you have communication that's both, you know, between cells locally and then between distant cells. So you have to build in communication systems there. That may be what bloodstreams are, what nervous systems are, what endocrine systems are, immune systems, etc. So you can sort of quickly build up, as long as you follow the rationale that all you're trying to do is to sort of resist entropy, you know, built within the second law of thermodynamics. So if you do that, you can go from very simple to very complex systems very quickly. And so then you reframe, and that's sort of inherent to the free energy principle. And then, you know, you can reframe that by saying, and give different names. You could say, well, look, when you take in something in, it sets an expectation, you know, and then you do something that's the sort of reality, you know, and then you have a potential for expectation and reality to match up or not match up. And if they don't match up, it will create something that is a mismatch. And in sort of free energy principle and Bayesian sort of terms, you might frame that a thing called surprisal. You can think of it as broadly similar to surprising, you know, something that doesn't fit is surprising, it feels surprisal. And you have to do something to minimize that surprisal, minimize entropy. And so, again, if you go back to a cell, you have all these control systems, internal and external systems that help to put a bound on surprisal, on entropy. You know, you have to control things. If you think back to our dorsal horn, maybe you've got, you know, an expectation of what comes in by all the receptors expressed on a dorsal horn neuron. The reality of what comes in is the passage of things like glutamate, GABA, substance P, BDNF across that membrane. That may or may not fit with the sort of, if you like, expectation that may be set in terms of things like the functioning of receptors on the dorsal horn cell postsynaptically. And a way of modifying that is either to change the biology of that cell within the dorsal horn, secondary messengers activated, you know, epigenetic factors, genetic de novo expression of new receptors or different expression, or you could use remote systems to control that surprisal, and that's what descending modulatory pathways may be doing. Yeah. So I've dragged us quickly into the nervous system, and that may be
no, I think it's beautiful, and there's a lot of things here that I would need to go back and revisit in order to understand. But I'll try and recap just briefly. And from what I understand is that we have these excellent theories that are, you know, at probably the highest level of theories. They're sort of trying to explain close to anything, basically, the free energy principle, that is. And it gives you a clear understanding of what it takes for life to exist, basically. Not necessarily how consciousness develops. But then you add on this principle of, I would say, learning or adaptability or reactivity, which could be the predictive processing theory. And when you combine those two, you can actually start to see things that we already understand, such as the nervous system, in a different light. So we're doing basically what we have been doing all along. You have the same information, you have the same, if you like, patient doing the same thing, saying the same symptoms are occurring, but you're using a different approach to understand it. And then I think this begs the question, and probably all of the theories begs the question, does that make a difference in the clinic?
Yeah. Well, I think the thing is that I would go to is, if you like, if we somehow try to draw free energy principle, which you actually done really nicely there, and you know, I don't necessarily need to do a lot of work to improve upon that, if indeed I can, to get sort of free energy into PP. So, and into maybe an understanding of pain, and then into the clinic. We sort of somehow need to do that, I think. Yeah.
Good idea.
To satisfy the listeners. So if we say,
well, you actually did it at a biological level, but only nociception, that is. Yeah.
But one of the key things I want to do is to say that, look, we who are fans of the free energy principle and predictive processing think it applies as much to sociological impacts on the body as we do to the biology of the body. We think that it's a unifying theory that is able to cope with all of those different aspects, the biological, the psychological, and sociological. So the biopsychosocial, I think it's one of the few theories of pain, neuroscientific functioning of your nervous system that extends out into interactions with your world, which actually is easily able to incorporate all of those things. And I know some of its opponents say, well, it's all things to all people, you know, you can't have that, we're not having that. But the idea is that on every level, if you have expectations that may be set in terms of expression of receptors, or you have an expectation of what's going to happen, back to the fear avoidance, and then you have something that either confirms or negates that, you have to do something. So if you have fear avoidance, you have an expectation the movement will hurt, then you move and it is painful, your prediction is confirmed. Then why update your model? No, actually, if anything, you reinforce that model. And that's also that we shouldn't forget that it's not just a change of model. It could be keep the model firmly fixed because it's working. And that might be what's happening with people with persistent pain, is that their overwhelming thoughts and feelings and movement all produce pain. Therefore, within this sort of construct, which is against those ideas that are more purpose driven, this has to be a purpose to everything. No, this is saying actually having pain makes the most sense for your situation, particularly when you've, if you like, tested that with movement or thoughts and feelings, or going to a physical therapist or having some surgery. And now it's actually confirmed that that does give you a pain experience. You won't update that model. You'll stick with that model. And I know, again, come back to Abby, she's written a paper recently where she sort of describes it as stickiness, and I think that's quite a nice construct and paper we've written recently. We sort of use that and we build upon it with a couple of philosophers and myself. But that might be what we've got. We've got confirmation of a model and reconfirmation of a model, so that model becomes stuck. So, but that gives us a great opportunity if we can somehow find a way with people who have a stuck model, if I can use that term, with pain. If we can somehow unstick it, we can give a degree of flexibility to it, then we may make a significant change to that person by updating their model. Is it likely we'll update the model to go from, a daily experience of pain to no pain in a single treatment applied once? Incredibly unlikely. Perhaps the one arena where people are beginning to think that might just be possible is the use of high dose psychedelics, which are known to change neurobiology in such a way to make the system much more plastic and to cause
you could say unstick the model if you were to use the same terminology.
Exactly. It's like, having super glue and you've got that sort of antidote stuff to super glue. It's like pouring that on. Yeah, I mean, it's a terrible analogy, but there you go. But
can I just ask a question again here? So
everything. It's your job.
I think the stickiness here is it's easy to understand that you're stuck with a model, and that could explain why you're still in pain where there's nothing nociceptive going on, perhaps. I think that mimics pretty well the idea of how dangerous is this really, but you're taking the conscious thought or decision out of it, and you're putting it more at a biological level. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, I think, to be fair to Lorimer, I don't think Lorimer demanded that your brain makes a conscious decision of how dangerous is this really. I
completely agree, but that was sort of the it led on to that by some people.
Yeah. So I think the thing really, well, do I have anything to add to that? No, I've said what I want to say in instant response to that. But I think here, this ties in with cognitive inflexibility. This idea that people's life world becomes constrained, their way of thinking, their way of doing becomes constrained, which, Lance McCracken, Steve Morley, all those guys have pioneered a model. We often need to challenge thoughts and feelings. We need to somehow interrupt the confirmation of those models. But an important component here is models within that construct are normally updated due to either the processes of if you like, thinking, feeling, giving sensory inputs that actually negate the model's construct validity, or at the same time, by action, by changing our relationship with the world, by getting people if you like, changing the sensory flow, changing what you're exposed to, how you're exposed to it. And that's a real beautiful thing for movement-based therapies. If you like, perceptual influence, let's give it its proper name, is maybe how mindfulness, how talking therapies work, changing sort of central models. But I also think that's how some manual therapies work, some movement therapies work. but also how exercise might work is to change this thing called active inference. And the great thing is, it's not either or. And this is going back to the neural matrix, because a lot of people say, hey, this has got huge similarities to the matrix. But one of the things that matrix was very clear about is you have movement as an outcome. Movement is temporally and spatially. He tried to overcome that by saying, in infinitesimal amounts, but it was separated and is a resultant of having pain. In our model, we're saying actually, pain is constituted by the whole thing. It's constituted by your thoughts, feelings, sensory inputs, and also your actions on the world. They can't be separated. But the other beautiful thing about that is if pain is that made up of that huge conglomeration of all those different factors, is any of those factors, any point in time, if you hit upon the right strategy for the person, is going to change their pain experience. Yeah. And I know you're particularly, your own research is on so-called descending modulation. And you and I have had discussions about descending modulation of pain, and I don't buy into that term, because that would suggest you have pain at a lower level, number one, because you can then modulate it at the spinal cord. Number two is it suggests that you have pain first and then you modulate it. Whereas I think you have descending modulation. And if that process is effective at getting these models updated in the right way, you've no reason to have pain. So pain will never actually occur. Yeah. And you could say, but what if you have had pain? Surely then you're doing something about it. But what we're talking about is a dynamic system that changes to always make sense of your current situation. So and this is a powerful message for patients, just because you've been in pain at this moment in time, if we get it right, the next moment in time, you won't be.
And, that's the message that everybody wants to hear. So I think both in the interest of time and because my mind is starting to boil with ideas, and I think the next thing we need to do is have some good food and some beers and really develop these ideas. I'm definitely looking forward to that. But just trying to sort of maybe come to an end here and try to see if we can recap.
Shut me up.
No, not really shut you up. I'm probably trying to make it elegantly closed, because I think this will be an infinite discussion for quite some time. And since we cannot use the model today to go out and say this is how you use it, I'm going to choose a different question, which is, if you were to point to, you think we can? I see you putting up your finger.
Yeah, I actually do think we don't have scientific data to say we can, that I can show you an RCT that's used this approach. But I think we can. I think, for example, thoughts, feelings, ideas in patients, which may, in a Bayesian term, be given the construct of priors, alterations in afferent input could again be in Bayesian terms be thought of as likelihood, the current state of tissues, and then trying to establish the dominance of those particular two components in relation to each other could well give us an indication of where we start treatment. Too often it's been either psychology treatment or non-psychology treatment. Actually, the balance of those two things in an individual may determine how much of one or the other the same individual needs. But I would say it's a unifying theory that it doesn't separate peripheral and the body and the tissues from the mind, and that's how it overcomes dualism for me. And then in a clinical practice, it's saying that probably every single person, and there's nothing revolutionary in that, is needs both of those aspects of care, but how much we weight that care, where we bias that care, is going to be determined by our ability to use both subjective and objective examinations and interviewing and discussion and testing with the person to determine where we should start and how much of something we should do. And that actually, though, is the challenge, that all good clinicians need to have the biggest repertoire of skills and techniques available to them. And it's no good just having one end of that functional system. You know, we need
that's just a perfect introduction to the question I was actually going to ask you anyways.
Sorry.
Because no, don't be. You always told us at King's that there's difference in the kind of science you do, and you could do the RCTs, and they're gonna, with all the restraints and problems and that, they do show you something, but they're not gonna give you sort of an idea of the. I think you might have used the term proper science at some point. So my question is, if you were given the opportunity to create or develop or invent a new technology that could be used to measure either predictive coding or entropy or free energy principle, if you were to do that, what type of thing, what would be the output? Would it be millivolts? Would it be thoughts? Would it be responses from a patient on a questionnaire? What would be the output of this new technology that could be proved, that could help support your theory?
Yeah, I think surprisingly and erroneously on my part, I've not stressed enough about active inference, interaction with the world, action. I think the key in pain is right there in this idea: we act on our world, we change our world, or indeed we stop acting on our world, we stop having agency over our world, we stop controlling, and we are in control by our pain and not prepared to do things. Because I think active inference is increasingly seen to probably dominate the sort of perspective over even perceptual inference, and maybe it's a false dichotomy to choose between. Andy Clark and myself, who obviously been a huge influence and helped me to develop some of my thinking over the last 4 or 5 years, and I owe him an enormous amount. We played around with this term perception, that actually we didn't know how to spell it really, but perception would be perception and action. They're too often separated, they're too often represented two sides, two alternative sort of sides, but they are a coin, and if I show you one side of a coin, you may say that's heads and the other side's tails. And people are tempted to say that. I show you a coin, you say, oh, it's heads or it's tail. But no, it's a coin. It's one object. I can look at it from different perspectives, and that maybe is a lovely analogy that I've used for years, and you probably heard before, because tails could be the body and heads could be psychology. But no, it's coin. It's a person. It's a living, caring, loving, loved, actionable, beautiful, unique human, or indeed animal, and that's the demand for personalized medicine, because that person is shaped, formed, modeled, structured, whatever biology or not biology you want to put to people. And that's again something that I think emerges out of a PP framework, is that we're dealing with unique people in unique contexts with unique experiences, and therefore if you do go to their biology will always be unique to them. So if you've got a one size fit model or an expectation of someone's biology as being this, I think you're more likely to be wrong than right. So we've got to find a way of being more right than wrong, and this is what I think this sort of modern construct helps. And it's beholden and dependent and shows homage to all these beautiful ideas that have gone before, that you've enabled us to have a discussion about.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful endpoint, and I still haven't really understood how we could measure. So how we could do that basic science that would give us an idea. I know. So let me paraphrase it. I know that we have discussed looking at the same data that I used for instance, for my PhD on descending modulation, and looking at it, the same set of data, looking at it from a different perspective.
Yeah.
And I think that's what you're saying, isn't it? It's as much about understanding that it's not a neuron, it's a person.
Yeah,
I
think
therefore we can use the same models. The same data.
Yeah, and I think unfortunately, probably you've opened up a discussion that we won't have, but that's where a methodology like dynamic causal modeling that was developed by Carl Friston for neuroimaging, but is increasingly being used for ePhys data. We can now use that with all the audience because they're now all in the gang, ePhys. So the principles of that are now being used to look at disease states and management and treatment of disease states, and how you might, even if you can model the disease, then you can model the treatments when you know the physiological effects of the treatments, and then use that to build a way of determining biomarkers in one direction, what we know is indicative of something, and then probably drive treatment and give an expectation of outcome, and then comparing outcome, which direction the outcome is, whether it's good enough or not good enough. Obviously, if it's good enough, it's fine, but if it's not good enough, how does it differ from the perceived model? And then what do we know might be able to be done to better or make that more efficacious? And perhaps we better stop because it's just not going to get to any end. But I mean, I think those things are all out there, with some people in the non-clinical world holding all that knowledge, and no one's ever given them a viable reason to use it for a better purpose. And that's hopefully one of the things that I've been trying to do for a number of years, is link really bright theoretical people with really bright clinical people, and try to, in our case, really affect the lives of, in a good way and a better way, and improving the lives of people who are suffering every day with this terrible thing called persistent pain.
Yeah, I definitely would. Yeah, I mirror that completely. And if if our theories do that, if we get any closer to actually supporting and helping these people, then they're good theories in essence. So I'm just going to summarize what I've heard, because the question we posed and the title of this podcast is Theories, Are They Necessary or Driving Progress? And I've taken a few notes of some of the points that we have highlighted along the way. Is that theories rely on technological progress. So we can expect that whenever new technologies evolve, such as big data, for instance, or artificial intelligence, theories are likely to evolve as well. And theories are there to make sense of data. So the same data can be experienced or can be seen through different lenses, which we could consider theories to be. And I've added, and I think we have agreed on this, but you can correct me if I'm wrong, that theories are inherently wrong because they're trying to make sense of something. They're not necessarily truth. They're trying to make sense in that that's their nature, rather than being correct.
Yeah, we've shown all the theories we've discussed, including the one I favour at the moment, have a temporary truth, and they're likely to be replaced. The one thing I'd say, though, that I would want listeners who may not be, who are clinicians or people experiencing pain and may not have, if you like, our scientific ways of thinking, is I don't think it's just though technology drives those things. I think human experience drives those things too. And we've touched upon Louis and Dave and Lorimer and actually lots of other people, including Pat Wall, actually, driven by the need to answer clinical perspectives. So let's not forget people and their experience and their thoughts and their feelings and their behaviors in that. Because while it's not as sexy as technology to some, in the real world, it's all that really matters. Most of the technologies we have are only trying to, or should do, trying to make our lives easier and better. And sadly, you know, my politics will probably come in at the end, is the problem with that is most of those technologies are only there for the rich and so-called advanced populations.
Yeah.
And
I think
therefore we believe we only learn from those communities, and science is the very epitome of that, whereas we can learn from human beings because we have a shared experience.
I think this goes to show just where I have my understanding from, because the next line on my paper here is: theories are novel but in a lineage, understand history, culture and context. So they're never, you know, ideal, but they're also never completely new. They build on something, and we need to understand it in context, as you just so perfectly framed. And then finally, I would say that if treatment works, it doesn't mean that the theory is correct. And also, being the best at a technique doesn't necessarily give you good outcomes. So there's much more to treating pain than to understanding a theory. And I think this has been, you know, one of the things that you've said the most during this talk. So I don't know if you want to end with any suggestions or any comments to the listeners.
I suppose, you know, be humble, know what you know what you don't know, be open-minded, listen to people who have the very lived experience, try to understand it. If you can't do anything else, be empathetic, supportive, but most of all, go on the journey together and don't be scared of where that's going to take you, and learn from that experience. And you make a difference every day if you're a clinician, and that is a hugely powerful and positive way of having an existence. So yeah, good on you. And you know, some of us doff our hat to people who experience pain and those people who are treating pain all the time. That's it.
And then it's on me to say thank you so much, Mick. It's been, I think, close to 3 hours. It's been amazing. There's so much information here that I'm looking forward to listening to again, and to seeing you again, of course. But COVID and travel restrictions is keeping us apart. But I'm really happy that you would spend time with us recording this podcast, and I hope a lot of people will benefit from it. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Morten. And Nicholas, I know you're there as well, so thank you, mate, and thank you for, you know, your support.